Hi friends, my name is Amit Mukherjee and I am from Hostbooks Limited. आपका आज के इस वेबिनार में बहुत स्वागत है। आज हमारे साथ श्री CA Kamal Agrawal जी साथ में and he will be taking care of the entire webinar. Friends, we all are aware of ongoing pandemic. It's affecting us either financially or emotionally. Work from home is the new way of living life. Business across the segment are being affected in some or other way. Most of them have no options left but discontinuation of their operations. Others are stressed on how they will be able to manage their tax compliance. On the other hand, it has given many different perspectives towards life. One is the right technology adoption to manage your business effectively. Technologies like cloud are acting as a boom for all of them, whether managing finances or GST compliance, they can do it easily online. We at Hostbooks enable small business owners to go digital by helping them manage their GST compliances online through our automated software solutions. We have simplified compliance for over 33,000 customers across the country. Today, we have with us eminent indirect tax specialist CA Kamal Agrawal, who will enlighten us on a few burning issues in GST and the importance of technology adoption. CA Kamal has more than 30 years of experience and also has worked with Big Five consulting companies. He is a faculty at ICAI for indirect taxes and is a regular speaker at various chambers of commerce on indirect taxation, including GST. Mr. Kamal has delivered more than 1,000 lectures and is a prominent speaker at CII, SHM, FICCI, ICAI, PhD chambers, Indo-Europe Business Forum, and of course, London School of Economics. Team Hostbooks welcome you. Mr. Kamal, thank you so much for being with us today. Now I'll request Mr. Kamal to take over and start his discussion today.
Thank you, Mr. Mukherjee.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon to all people who have joined, and I'm really impressed by the large number of people who have joined on this afternoon. Probably on this day, somebody was thinking that people will have a nice lunch and sleep, but a very good number of people have joined just to understand what GST, the burning issues and few topics that we want to discuss. So friends, first topic, and never mind the sequence mentioned in the webinar, this page, but let's go in the sequence that I feel appropriate. And because first topic is GST on director's remuneration, which is coming from reverse charge, and unless we understand reverse charge, how we can understand the director remuneration implication. Let's go and understand the concept of reverse charge, and then we go into the subsequent issues coming from that. And I would request all participants to keep interacting, keep commenting in their chat box wherever I request you to be, so that we have some kind of feedback, because in live audience, we generally get a feedback. We know whether we are on same page, the message is getting across. But in this kind of a webinar, chat box is the option that we have to live with. So friends, first issue is of reverse charge. And you know, this is a very funny title. If we all know GST is an indirect tax, and indirect tax is supposed to be paid by the person who is providing goods or services, and it has to be borne by somebody else who is the recipient of those goods or services. So that has been the genesis of indirect tax, because it is not borne by the person. It is, he always collects it from somebody. So that is, we know as a forward charge. He collects the money from and he pays to the government. But when it comes to reverse charge, and reverse charge as a term has been used by GST for the first time, but we know this kind of concept was there in India for quite some time. When I first heard about this concept, it was very long back. It was more prevalent in context of European law. When I first studied the European VAT, the reverse charge term came in, and I said, what is this reverse charge? So forward charge is and I tell you, very funny and very silly thing probably came to my mind. Uh, and I guess most of the funny things are silly as well. That I said, forward charge we pay tax to the government, and reverse charge is government going to pay me back some of the taxes that I have already paid. But then I realized, no, it's not the case. So that is the reverse charge. What is reverse charge is, as that we know, tax is generally or principally to be paid by the supplier. But government believes, legislator believe, that in some cases, tax should not be paid by the supplier, but it should be paid by the recipient. Okay, that is how it is called reverse charge. And we know reverse charge was there in service tax also. We paid service tax on import of service. We paid on variety of input service like GTA, legal, and all that. So that was very well there in service tax. Can anybody tell me any other law in which this concept was prevailing, maybe with this different name? You can use your chat box and give me some responses, please. Quickly. It should not be difficult for people of Gujarat, Haryana. I'm just giving you hints so that I can know the connection is also live. No response. Probably it was like, yes, Nikhil has said, yes, a lot of questions. Yes, now it is coming. Nikhil Gupta has responded. Yes, Sudesh Bhatt has responded. Many people are responding. Few are, I'm getting some right answer, some wrong answer, but yes, people are responding. It was actually the purchase tax. In VAT regime, a lot of states have this concept of payment of tax, paying of purchase tax. You know, when you purchase something from unregistered dealer, like in Haryana, if I'm not wrong, or if my memory serves me correctly, if you purchase paddy from the farmers, you are liable to pay purchase tax. In Gujarat also, the purchase tax was a very, very prominent concept. And there was a lot of states has this concept that if you sell within the state or you sell on interstate basis charging CST, then maybe you not have to pay purchase tax. But if you do stock transfer where state do not get any tax, then you have to pay purchase tax. So as a concept, it is not new. It is not something which was introduced by service tax also, as many people believe. But it was there in VAT regime, and we all know that. So it is coming from those days, and the concept was kind of same. So we know, like, now understand the concept that liability is not on the supplier, but liability is on the recipient, and the recipient has to pay tax on that, and that is what is called reverse charge. So reverse charge is defined in section 2 subsection 98 of the CGST Act, and which provides that liability to pay tax by the recipient under section 9 subsection 3 and 4 of the CGST Act and section 5 subsection 3 and 4 of the IGST Act. Now, another small question which I would like to ask my audience, and just the depth of the knowledge. GST is levied on what? Very basic question. We are talking about having a seminar. What is the GST levied on? I got an answer. Yes, I'm getting answers, but I'm not getting the answer which I'm looking at. Okay, let me help you with that. See, if you go to CGST Act, Section 9. Section 9 says GST is levied on intra-state supply of goods and services. If you go to Section 5 of IGST Act, it says GST is payable on interstate supply of goods and services. So there is no tax on supply of goods and services. Tax is on intrastate supply of goods and services under CGST Act and on interstate supply of goods and services under IGST Act. Okay, so this is the distinction. When you read the law carefully, you find that a small word we have missed out. Okay, so we generally know it is on supply of goods and services, and we know supply of goods and services, which is correct, but the legislature used the word intrastate and interstate. And I do not have a PPT, some or attendees are asking for, because I want you to pay attention to what I'm saying, not to on a PPT. Now, when you all, and you may be all people who are dealing with GST, and some of them may be practitioners, this is a very, very fine distinction, fine point that we need to keep in mind. And just digressing the topic for a moment, let's assume that your transaction is of intrastate supply of goods and services, and the department has issued you a show cause notice under IGST Act, treating it as interstate supply of goods and services. Now, there can be a point to argue that show cause notice itself was issued under a wrong legislation, and there may be a situation tomorrow, we do not know what happened in the court tomorrow, that the court may say, since show cause notice was issued under a wrong legislation invoking wrong provisions, the show cause notice is invalid, void ab initio, and you can say it is a non-est. So there is a possibility that in some of the situation, you can get away from the all demands litigation only on these kind of technical points, but only if we are careful enough to identify and implement these technical points. Okay, thank you very much. So let's move forward. Now, we know Section 2, subsection 98 says tax is to be paid by recipient of goods and services. Okay, and in terms of Section 9.3 and 9.4 and 5.3 and 5.4 of CGST and IGST Act respectively. But who is the recipient of service? Then the next question comes in, because liability is to pay tax on recipient. We must understand who is the recipient. Now, is it recipient the person to whom services have been delivered, or is the recipient the person who has instructed somebody to deliver the services? And I give you an example. Let's say Hostbook says that they have maybe 30,000 subscribers or 50,000 subscribers. And Hostbook says that, sir, there may be GST queries to all the Hostbook subscribers. And we request you to, whenever there is a query coming from Hostbook subscriber, you kindly give them an opinion. And you give your views so that these are the people, they can also use your opinion in performance of their professional activities. I said, very well, I would be happy to do that, happy to assist the community, but who is going to pay to my fees and for my time and or my effort? So Hostbook says, sir, don't worry, whatever time and effort you incur, we will pay it to you. And we enter into a formal engagement letter with you. We agree on an hourly rate. Whatever hours you spent on giving advice to our subscribers, we will pay you at an hourly rate for that. Now, in this situation, my friends, who is the recipient? Now, Hostbook is not asking a single question. Please keep in mind, Hostbook is not asking a single question. They say, we are Hostbooks, we know our compliances, we are doing for many years, and we don't have any difficulty. So we don't want any opinion from you. We want your services for our subscribers. And we have not structured in a way that subscriber will send a letter to me and I will send it to you. No, we have given your mail ID We have given your contact details. Subscribers will directly contact you. You give them advice and you just tell us that these many hours have been spent on these many subscribers. We do not even want the name of the subscriber. So who is the subscriber recipient of service in this case? Okay, I got a two answer: Akshat Mittal, Vineet, Suresh, Nikhil. I said there are a lot many people. I should get more answers. Getting mixed. Somebody saying subscriber, somebody saying hostbooks. Okay, so yes, there are few right answers. Yes, somebody saying person who is liable to pay tax. Oh my God, tax is to be paid by me. Because if I receive consideration on that GST, I am a chartered accountant, I am liable to pay tax. So I cannot be the service provider and recipient at the same time. Many people have responded, given the correct answer. It is going to be host books, because the definition of recipient of service given by section 2 subsection 93, it says where consideration is payable, the person liable to pay consideration is the person who is going to be the recipient. So very correctly said by many of the attendees, it is going to be host books. So physical delivery of the service is not a relevant criteria here. It is the recipient who is liable to pay consideration, and he is going to be the recipient. Now, reading these two definitions together, where we say that person who is liable to pay consideration is the recipient, and liability on reverse charge is on recipient, and therefore, if I were, let's say, were an advocate and giving legal advice to the host book subscribers, it was host books which were liable to pay tax under reverse charge mechanism, and not the subscribers, or definitely not the lawyer. Are you with me? This is all clear to everybody? Wonderful, wonderful. So let's move forward. Now, where there is no consideration payable, the person to whom services have been delivered or goods have been delivered is the recipient, but we need not go into that route. We can talk about that concept someday later, because that is not relevant for our today's discussion. Now we go to section 9.3 and 5.3 that talk about liability to pay tax. So 9.3 and 5.3 say that there is a liability to pay tax under reverse charge mechanism by the recipient of service on notified goods and services. So what the law says, that there should be notified goods and services on which tax is to be paid by the recipient under reverse charge mechanism. So that is very clear. Then unless there is a goods or service which is not notified, there is no liability to pay tax on by the recipient under reverse charge mechanism. Now government, when a brought provision, they will bring notification also, because they want tax. So they have brought two notifications under CGST, one for goods and one for services. The notification number 4/2017 is for goods, and 13/2017 is for services, both under CGST Act. Notification number 4/2017 and 10/2017, they are under IGST Act for goods and services respectively. Okay, 4 and 13, 4 and 10/2017. Notification 4 under CGST Act and 4 under IGST Act are identical parameteria. There is no difficulty. Notification 13/2017 under CGST Act has 16 entries. Please listen carefully. It has 16 entries. And notification 10/2017 has 18 entries. Now, we generally presume that a notification issued under CGST Act and IGST Act, they are identical. So we have read CGST notification, We have read IGST also, we have read IGST, then it is CGST also. Okay. So, but I'm telling you, these two notifications, both for payment of tax under reverse charge mechanism on services, one has 16 entries and another has 18 entries. Okay. So what are the two entries which are different, which are there in IGST Act and not in CGST Act? Absolutely. So I'm getting answer already. Very, very smart audience. I'm loving it. So one is, and I've got one answer which is partially correct, and I would love to have more answers if I can. I can wait for a few seconds here. Anybody, please? It is not very difficult. Just think. You all are. It's a very, very intelligent audience. You please think. It will come very, very quickly to you. Now you say, why something which will be included in IGST and not in CGST? Because that has to be a transaction which is not possible under CGST Act. Now, what is not possible under CGST Act? If that is an import of service. And what is import of service? We have two separate entries which are there in this notification. One is ocean freight and another is OEDR services. Both these entries are by definition are received from overseas suppliers, and therefore they are covered under IGST notification, not under CGST and SGST notification. The point which I'm trying to make to you, friends, is not that the distinction between two notifications. The point that I'm trying to make here, that there could be a situation where a provision of an entry or a notification could differ between CGST and IGST. And therefore, it may take only 1 minute for us to ensure that whatever is, excuse me, whatever is notified under CGST Act, we must do a 1 minute comparison with the notification issued under IGST Act as well. Similarly, where a notification is issued under CGST and SGST of a particular state, we must do a comparison in those notifications also. Because many states have not issued many notifications or they have not implemented many provisions in their particular state because that is their domain and not in the central government domain. So it is important because we are all professionals. So therefore, we should do these comparisons. It may take 1 or 2 minutes, but let's say tomorrow somebody points out the anomaly and we would regret not spending those 2 minutes at that point in time. Okay. So let's move forward. We have to keep an eye on the watch as well. We talked about section 9.3 and 9.5.3. Then we come to 9.4 and 5.4 of CGST Act and IGST Act respectively. And this is the section which has created lots of hue and cry and a lot of funny questions we have received from our clients at that point in time. What was this provision? This provision says that if a registered person receive any supply of goods or services from an unregistered person, that registered person is liable to pay tax under section 9.4 and 5.4 of CGST and SGST, IGST respectively. Now, it went into a lot of this, that if I buy something, let's say for 100 rupees or 10 rupees, or I pay to a rickshaw 20 rupees, something I have to pay tax. So the government came up with a notification, okay, not going to small amount, but if your aggregate amount of your inward supplies from unregistered dealer exceeds 5,000 rupees, you have to pay tax per day. Very rightly said by Suresh. So they issued a notification exempting up to 5,000 rupees. But still it was very difficulty. 5,000 rupees per day for a person like me may be a good sum, but imagine Hindustan Lever or Unilever or a Dabur or Telco, for them 5,000 rupees per day is a very, very minuscule limit. So that was one issue. Another issue, we started getting queries because you remember at that time, you had to mention HSN of goods and SAC code of services also while you to file your return. So people started saying, sir, we called a Panditji for Diwali Puja. We paid to him 11,000 rupees. Please give us the code. So somebody was asking us the code of a samosa or some jalebi or something like that. And we were flooded with the queries which has no actual meaning to the business of the world. And that created a problem to the industry. How to comply with? Somebody is going into rent a cab, he is paying some money. Now, what is the, how do we pay tax on that place? So there was a lots and lots of issue that came in at that point in time. So then subsequently government realized and they said, okay, we withdraw this 5,000 rupees caveat and we kind of suspend this reverse charge mechanism for the time being, and we will come back and think what to do about it. Okay, so then on 13th October, if I remember correctly, 2017, they amended the notification, and this purchase from unregistered dealer was no longer applicable. Thereafter, the Act itself was amended, and they say because earlier provision in the Act was all supplies from unregistered person, whether notified or not. Then they amended the Act. They say only notified supply of goods and services for a certain class of taxpayers from unregistered person, that loan will be subject to tax under RCM in section 9(4) and 5(4) respectively. So what is the requirement? Class of taxpayers, notified goods and services procured from unregistered persons. 3 conditions. If all 3 conditions are fulfilled, only then there would be a liability to pay tax under RCM in terms of this provision. I hope I'm clear here. Yes, can somebody comment? Okay. Okay, perfect. So then they issued 2 notifications, both are under 7/2019 under CGST and IGST, where they said that the cement and some building material kind of supplies, and these notifications, I'm not going into entry into the notifications, but just as a concept. So 7/2019, which specified few categories of goods which have been procured from unregistered person and tax is payable on that. So those 2 notifications have been issued. Then we have a 9(5), you can say that tax is payable on e-commerce operator, but we don't have to go into that in that much detail today. We may do transaction-wise transaction webinar if Facebooks and you people require on individual entries into the notifications. Let's go to the next issue that comes in, that I'm a person, let's say, as a Kamal Agarwal, as an individual, or let's say my wife, she keeps procuring notified goods and services all the time. So let's say she has, we have moved our house from one place in Delhi to another place in Gurgaon, and she has engaged a good GTAs. We all know GTA is under reverse charge. So she has engaged a goods transport agency, which has been engaged to transport our household goods, because we were shifting our house from Delhi to Gurgaon, and they charge a huge amount of money. So is my wife, which is a simple housewife, not should say simple housewives are too important. So she is a homemaker, but not engaged in any business activity. is she liable to pay tax under reverse charge? And no, yes, I got an answer, no, okay. Somebody saying no, somebody saying yes, somebody saying no, okay. So at least people are not sleeping and giving me answer. Okay, so I'm getting most of the answer. Most of the people are saying no, yes, wonderful. Now, why no? Okay, I got an answer, only registered person, okay, not related to business. Okay, it is specifically exempt. Okay, let's move from that exemption. Let's assume there is a taxable activity. Maybe I picked up a wrong example. Let's say it was a taxable supply. Only registered person. Okay, okay, good, wonderful. So let me give you an answer. Now, section 24 specifically provides that if a person is liable to pay tax under reverse charge mechanism, he is compulsorily required to obtain a GST registration. If you are required to pay tax under RCM, you are required to obtain registration. When you are required to obtain registration, that means my argument that tax is to be paid only by registered person do not hold good, because I am liable to pay obtain registration, and therefore I will become registered person. So that is not a valid argument. Okay, not related to business is also not a very argument, because the requirement of to be in the course or furtherance of business is for the supplier, not for the person receiving the service. If a person engage in the business of, like say, selling toothpastes or toothbrushes, as we all procure from these people, you procure it for your personal use. You are not procuring for business purposes, but still GST is payable because the person selling to you is engaged in the business and he is supplying to you in the course or furtherance of business. So those arguments are not valid arguments. What is required? Take a closer look at the notification number 13/2017. It specifies it gives in the fourth column who is the recipient. The recipient is liable to pay tax. All the recipients defined in that notification are business entity. They say a company or a body corporate engaged in the business, somebody says a trust and or a litigant. So those people who are specified there, they are all business entity, not even a single individual who is not registered or kind of a person not engaged in business is specified there. And therefore, no person who is kind of my wife or a homemaker is required to pay tax under GST on reverse charge mechanism on under RCM. But the point again, if you are liable to pay tax in terms of notification 13 or those notifications, then you are mandatorily required to obtain registration. Absence of registration is an offense, not an argument for not paying GST. I hope I'm clear here. Okay. Yes, wonderful. Then we come to the next question. When tax is to be paid? You know, we all know tax is to be paid on at the time of supply as defined in the CGST Act. Now, if you have noticed carefully, this time of supply provisions very clearly define time of supply provisions for goods and services separately and for forward charge and reverse charge separately. So forward charge time of supply provisions are different from reverse charge. Time of supply provisions are different for goods and for services. So whatever is your case, on that basis, you can choose what is your time of supply and then you have to pay tax accordingly on that basis. Now, if you say, let's take an example of goods, which is covered under Section 12 of the CGST Act. What Section 12 says? Yes. Section 12G, one very intelligent audience is helping me out here. It says that date of receipt of goods or date of payment as entered into the books of accounts or debited in the bank account, or date immediately following 30 days from the date of invoice. So whatever is the earliest of the three events, that is the time when tax is payable under reverse charge mechanism. Now, one would presume that date of receipt of goods should not be the earliest event. Why would you receive invoice or not receive the goods? That can be in rare cases, but it can also happen. In most of the cases, date of receipt of goods, and as law provides that invoice has to be issued at the time of dispatching or supplying goods, has to be issued. So you would generally receive goods and invoices at the same time. But let's assume that he has supplied goods. You are living in Delhi. Somebody has supplied you goods from way back in Kerala. And there is a situation where because of no entry and all that, it takes about 45 days for him to reach from Kerala to Delhi. Okay. But the supplier sends you an invoice over an email. So even if you have not received the goods, even if you have not made the payment, your liability to pay tax under reverse charge mechanism will arise on the date following the 30th day from date of issuance of invoice. So if you are liable to pay tax under reverse charge mechanism, then you must ensure that your supplier immediately sends you an invoice, even if the goods and goods are while in transport. So you know the date of issuance of invoice and you are able to comply with your liability and you do not default on the payment of tax under RCM. Am I clear here? Wonderful. So this is how you have to look into what is the time of payment of tax under RCM in case of goods and services. Next question is, when do I take input tax credit? Or do I have a specific provision for availing input tax credit in case of reverse charge mechanism? Now, for reverse charge, for taking input tax credit, all the other requirements that you should have received goods and services, that you should have received goods and services, that you should be, that should have to be complied with. So all those conditions are to be complied with. But what the situation is that you do not receive the invoice. Let's say you are receiving certain transaction from an unregistered person. So you may not receive the invoice. Or if you are receiving the services from a lawyer or from a registered person, then you may receive the invoice which has a tick mark as if tax is to be paid under RCM. So in both cases, if you have received the services and you are eligible to avail credit. When you are eligible to take credit, and when you pay tax under RCM. So the moment you have paid tax under RCM, you are eligible to take credit. There was some confusion earlier. Then say, okay, there is a transaction which has happened in April. We have paid to somebody in April, and for April we paid tax in May. So do I need to wait till June for availing credit? No, you pay tax and you take credit. So you can pay tax in the same time and you can take credit in the same time. Okay, so both transactions, payment of tax and availing of credit, that can be done in the same month in the same return. Okay, now comes the next question. If I have received services from an unregistered supplier, what is the document on basis of which I can avail credit? You may all refer to rule 9 in the Senved rule, which used to list down what are the documents on which you can avail credit. Now here also there is a specific provision on the basis of which you can avail credit. In this case, you issue a self invoice, and on the basis of self invoice, you can avail credit. I have a very, very lovely and intelligent audience, which is kind of going a step further from me, giving me lots of inputs, and very rightly said that you raise a self invoice, and on that basis, you can avail credit. Okay. So that is the overview of reverse charge mechanism. I hope reverse charge mechanism clear to all you guys. Now, we've been, somebody's asked that, can we ask a question? My suggestion is that we can keep the few minutes at the end for question answer session. And if we have time permits, we can take question answer today. Otherwise, I would request Hostbooks to comply all the questions, and we can arrange all these questions to be responded to you if the time does not permit today. Okay. So now let's go to the next topic. And I mentioned that notification number 13 bar 2017 that talks about tax on GST on director's remuneration. It says that tax is to be paid in case of services rendered by a director to a company or to a body corporate. The tax is to be paid by the company or by the body corporate under reverse charge mechanism. In this regard, we got a recently advanced ruling by Rajasthan Advanced Ruling Authority, which says that in case of Claycraft India Private Limited, which says that director's remuneration was subject to GST under RCM mechanism. And that is very much in line with the notification 13 bar 2017. Now then, what is the difficulty? The difficulty was that in the same ruling, while recording the submissions of the applicant, they also mentioned that directors were working as an employee of the company. Their salary was subjected to TDS under section 192 of the Income Tax Act. Those people were also subjected to provisions of ESI and PF. So we know there is an entry number 1 in schedule 3, which says that employee services provided by an employee in the course of an employment is not subject to service tax. Now, when you say that those were directors, yes, they were directors. Were they employee? The Advanced Ruling Authority judgment seems to list down all these, that they were subject to section 192, they were subject to ESI, they were subject to PF, yet they concluded that the directors were not employee of the company and that transaction is subject to reverse charge. And this ruling has created lots and lots of among the professional community. And it is a typical example how you can get a bad ruling on the basis of how you argue your case. While you go through that ruling, you notice that at several places, where they have recorded the submissions of the applicant. The recording of submission or the submission, now we do not know, we do not have the submissions, but we have the submissions as recorded in the advanced ruling authority order. How the advanced ruling authority order records? Those peoples were working, also working as an employee of the company. The authority templates say applicants submit that they are treated as par as the other employee, at par as other employees. So you are not saying they are the employee. You are saying they are treated at par with other employee. You are saying you are working as they are also working as employees. You are not saying they are the employees. You are not saying they are the employees and they are the directors as well. And I believe that is one of the very, very crucial point in that advanced ruling, which was not mentioned very categorically before the advanced ruling authority. Another case we can say, and if you look at very carefully, in this subject, in this point, GST is not the primary law. The primary law may be the Contract Act or maybe any other act, because we have two conflicting entries. We have an entry which deals with director and an entry which deals with employee. Directors we know is dealt with Companies Act. Employees under various acts, even under Contract Act. So the first point that should have been done in such cases is first to determine the nature of relationship. You cannot go to GST state without addressing the nature of relationship. There are numerous Supreme Court decisions which specified, which has held in what cases a director can be deemed to be director will qualify as an employee, in what cases a director will not qualify as an employee. None of that Supreme Court decisions were presented before the authority. Even the director's salary being subject to reverse charge was under service tax also. There are at least 3 tribunal decisions which has dealt with this issue. None of the 3 tribunal decisions were also presented before the authority. So when the existing jurisprudence, which is already available on the subject, was not presented before the authority, the facts were not very presented in a very watertight manner, then there are chances that you may get a judgment like Claycraft, which is very, very kind of a departure from what is the existing jurisprudence and what is the correct position of law. In my submission, there are 2-3 Supreme Court decisions, one in the case of ESI, one in case of Ram Prasad, where one was the case of income tax, another was case of whether a particular managing director should be subject to ESI and PF. In both cases, Supreme Court has laid down parameters that in what cases a director would be considered as an employee. So there would be a master and servant relationship. Those decisions should have been presented, and there may be several other decisions. Those decisions should have been presented in order to arrive at what is the true nature of relationship. Now, if you determine the true nature of relationship in terms of those Supreme Court decisions, then the next question becomes very easy, because if you arrive at a decision that yes, they are directors and not the employee, definitely service tax under RCM is payable. If you arrive at the conclusion that they were employees and not only directors, they are directors as well as employees, then definitely reverse charge is not applicable. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that we need to identify that what are the transactions where GST law has to take a step back and then let other laws determine the true nature of relationship. And once the other laws determine the true nature of relationship, then GST law comes into picture and tell you what is the GST implications having uh, the relationship which has already been determined. So in my view, given the all the parameters that they were salary was subjected to 192 and they were covered by ESIPF, although these are also not the conclusive evidence. You could be deducting tax under 192 while the relationship can still be a director, not an employee. Even then, taking an argument that because his remuneration is subject to tax under 192 is not the conclusive argument. You have to see, does there is a contract? Do you have a employment contract with that person? What does that employment contract say? So basic agreement with that person is the key to determine the nature of relationship. And that I would digress for a minute here. And I've just referred to a post which I did a couple of days back. And I was reading a judgment by ITAT, wherein they have held, and you know, we all know that in international companies, there are secondment of people that happen. Indian people go abroad people come to India. And while a person from a US may come to India to work with Indian subsidiary, he would continue to have his employment status in the US company. Because if you say you resign from US, you go to India, and when you come back, you again join the US company, nobody will agree. They will say, I lose all my seniority, I lose my social security, I lose a lot of my employment benefits, so I'm not interested in going. So what happened? They say, okay, we would enter into a secondment agreement between company in the US and the company into India. And in terms of that agreement, you go to Indian company and work under the control and supervision of the Indian entity. So far, so good. That all happened. But ITAT specifically noticed that there were no employment agreement between the Indian entity and the person seconded to India. So they say there is no privity of employment between Indian entity and the secondee. And on that basis alone, they held that the presence of secondee in India for a long period of time constitute a permanent establishment of US company in India. And the income that was somewhere around 32 lakhs, which was being reported, that jumped to a few hundred crores. So the point that we need to make is that the documentation is the key in terms of litigation, not only tax litigation, but most of other litigation also. So you need to have a document which clearly specifies the nature of relationship, and the tax implications would only follow subsequently, not will drive the tax implications. Okay, so that point is clear. It was just digressing a little bit, but I thought this is very wonderful audience, and I must kind of share my views on that topic. Are you with me here now? Wonderful, 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 lovely. Now we come to the next topic, the Rule 36(4). This is also one of the very, very hot topic that is being debated. GST Council in this meeting on 20th September, and we know all that we have this menace, as they call it, of fake invoices. Now, fake invoice, you can call or you can call circular trading. There are two kinds of transactions which are happening. In both cases, goods and services are not being supplied physically, but the invoices are being supplied. In one case, there is a payment of tax by everybody, but no goods and services are being supplied. In another case, the person who is originating the transaction, he pays the entire tax from using his SENVAT credit or using the input tax credit, while he has no credit in his 2A, and all the subsequent people, they take credit on the basis of his invoices. And those invoices, then people, even I've come across an example that in one case, somebody has raised invoices to the extent of 350 crores. And people down the chain even taken input tax credit. They have claimed even refund on case of inverted duty structure, while the person having a turnover of 350 crore has purchase of only 23 lakhs, and he has paid the entire tax through input tax credit. Not even a single penny in cash was deposited. So the government was extremely worried that these large number of cases involving huge amounts, that was eating up their revenue. And in that context, they thought of bringing this provision that whatever input tax credit you avail, which is not reconciled with your 2A, you can only take credit to the extent of 20% of the eligible credit. So they put a cap of 20% on the credit that you can take in case of this mismatching. Now, this provision was introduced by way of amendment in the rules. Rule 36(4) was introduced. Now, there was a lot of debate within the professional community that whether this Rule 36(4) is legally tenable or not. Because, you all know provisions of ITC are under Section 16. Section 16 has inbuilt conditions or restrictions for availing input tax credit. This cap of 20% was not there. So people say, unless there is a requirement in the law, how can you impose such a restriction in case of by way of rules? Another view which is coming, so if you read section 16(1) carefully, it says subject to such conditions and restrictions as may be prescribed. And we know what the law defined prescribed as prescribed in the rules on the advice of the GST Council. So there are both views which are prevalent. It's being debated. I also learned that this provision has been challenged in various high courts. We will have to wait how the high court interpret, and we'll see what happens there. Another line of argument which is coming, that government has brought similar provision under section 43A. So section 43A has identical provision that empowers this government to put a cap of maximum 20%, allow credit to maximum 20% in case of mismatch or unmatched invoices. Now, 43A was introduced in 2018, but 43A has not been made effective till date. So you could not have issued a rule under a provision which itself has not yet been made effective. Now 43A goes out of picture. Only picture remains is section 16, where they say on subsection 1, subject to such conditions and restrictions. So can it be a restriction which is drawing its power from section 16? We'll have to wait and see how the various high courts that decide about it. But till the time this judgment is struck down, I'm bound by it. So we have to comply with it. and we have to live with it. Otherwise, we would be flooded with the show cause notices on this point. So how we need to apply this? And this was 20% limit, which was subsequently reduced to 10%. When this 20% limit came in, this provision came in, a lot of us in the professional community made representation, and we were hoping that government will remove this provision. But to our surprise, the GST Council has reduced this 20% even to 10%. That was kind of a New Year gift. Effective 1st January 2020, this has become 10%. And that's how government has reiterated, yes, this provision is not going to go away. This provision is going to stay. And you better learn how to comply with it. So in this background, what does this provision says? This provision says that if there are invoices which are not uploaded, invoices or debit notes, which are not uploaded by the supplier, so you can only take credit now 10% between 9th November 2019 and 31st March 20%. You can only take 10% of that credit. Let's assume you have 10 lakh rupees of credit in your books of accounts. You have 8 lakh rupees in your 2A. So 10 lakh rupee ITC in your books of accounts. And of course, you would take ITC, only eligible ITC in the books of accounts. You will not take what is not eligible. So you have 8 lakh rupee in your books of accounts. You have 10 lakh rupees in your 2A. Sorry, it got reversed. 10 lakh rupees in your books of accounts, 8 lakh rupees in 2A. So what you could have availed, as on date, when the limit is of 10%, you have 8 lakh rupees, which is matching. 10% you can add, you can only await 8 lakh 80,000 rupees. So you take 8 lakh 80,000 rupees and you can use that for your payment of tax. But the remaining credit, you do a matching next month, and if you see whether more invoices have been uploaded, and you have to do that math again for that period. So you keep on doing this on month-on-month basis. You keep on doing on month-on-month basis. The credit is not going lost, but credit is getting deferred. Your ability to use that credit for payment of your tax is getting deferred. So therefore, it has to be done on a regular basis. It also requires you to do this reconciliation on monthly basis. Only then you will be able to avail full input tax credit. Let's take another example. You have, and due to which working capital will be blocked. Of course, I agree. There is no doubt about it. Now, let's take another example. You have 10 lakh rupees as input tax credit in your books of accounts. And you have all wonderful suppliers, all good people, very nice people. And you see that your 2A also gives you 10 lakh rupees. So it's perfect match. You say, okay, 10 lakh rupees, or let's assume it is 9 lakh 50,000 rupees. Not perfect match, it's 9 lakh 50,000. It's only 50,000 rupees unmatched. You say, okay, 9 lakh 50,000 rupees is match. I take this 9 lakh 50,000 rupees and I add 10%, which will be kind of 95,000. I take 9 lakh 50,000 plus 95,000, which is allowed by the law. 10% is allowed, and I add these two and I take that credit. Is it allowed? No, obviously. How can you go beyond the amount of input tax credit in your books of accounts? So you are capped to the maximum 10 lakh rupees. You cannot go beyond that. So you have to see what is your situation, your input tax credit in the books versus 2A. You do a math there. then you add 10%, see what you are still with below the input tax credit in your books, and therefore you can take that credit. On top of it, you can add few other credits. What are those credits? If you refer 36, it is only applicable in relation to invoices which are to be uploaded by the suppliers. When it is to be, there are certain transactions which are not to be uploaded by suppliers. Which are those transactions? Import of goods. You file a bill of entry, you can take credit. You pay tax under RCM, you can take credit. In these cases, it is not, the suppliers are not liable to upload the invoices. So those credits you can avail without having them in 2A, and for them the restriction of 10% also does not apply. So first you do a math, you do a reconciliation, ignoring those credit of import of goods and of RCM and similar credits. You do a basic mathematics, you arrive at what is your input tax credit, and thereafter you add import RCM, and that becomes your total input tax credit, which you can then use for your payment of output tax liability. Understood? Wonderful. Now, of course, this provision creates a lot of issues because the reconciliation itself is a very tedious task. Reconciliation of 2A versus normal invoice is a hell of a job. Okay, and that too, doing it on a month-to-month basis, that becomes extremely time-consuming job. On top of it, there was a circular which was issued, circular 123, which says you have to take credit on the date of filing of GSTR 1. So if you take the credit on GSTR 1, let's say somebody is filing return at the 8 o'clock in the evening and you are seeing 2A at a 5 o'clock, that creates an issue. You may lose some amount of credit plus 10% buffer on that. There is another issue. There is no such requirement in the rule. The rule does not specify a date. Rules only specify you can take credit only to this extent. Now you have to file your GST at 3B on 20th. You are a nice taxpayer. You say, okay, I will file on 17th or 18th. Why you should stick to the 2A on 10th or 11th, which was the date as per by circular? And can circular override the provisions of the rule? Clearly no. Circular is only job is to clarify what is the understanding of the government of a particular provision. That is all. Circular is not binding on taxpayers. Circular is not binding on courts. So circular can only clarify what is already there in the provisions or in the rules. Circular cannot impose any further restriction. Now, the moment circular imposes a restriction, you can either challenge the circular or you can ignore that. So for a moment, we say, okay, we decide to ignore the provision. We download 2A on the date when we want to file my 3B. And on that date, we see what is amount appearing in 2A, and we take credit on that date. What is the positive side of it? It adds a lot of work for the people who are complying with. What is the positive side of it? Positive side is that you are able to track your vendors who are defaulters in filing returns or who are not uploading your invoices. You may do a reconciliation a year and a half later. By the time you see that a huge amount of input tax credit in relation to a particular few vendors that is not appearing in my 2A, and you tell you see, okay, where are those vendors? You suddenly find that those vendors are not responding for the last 5-6 months. And you see, array, what happened? What couldn't we do? And those vendors are nowhere to be found. But if you're doing this on a month-to-month basis, you know which are the vendors which are not uploading the invoices in 2A, and therefore in the very next month you can catch hold of them and you can tell them, look guys, I'm going to clear your payment only once I see your invoice in the 2A, otherwise I'm going to withhold your payment. So it has a positive side as well, but legality also, legal issues are here and a lot of work, reconciliation work that is there. But my understanding is this provision is going to stay. The government is not going to give any relaxation unless this unless this menace, of fake invoices that is being removed. I don't think government is going to give us any benefit in terms of these provisions. Of course, any court can struck it down and the government can think it to bringing by way of an act or some other way. But for the time being, till it is struck down, this is a provision we must comply with. Otherwise, we would be liable for interest and other penal consequences. So this is what we talk about 36(4). Yes, there are issues. There are issues in terms of suppliers who file quarterly returns, supplier who are generally late filers. So those, we know GST is a self-policing kind of mechanism, and in these cases, those vendors would fall in line and they would also start filing returns regularly. There was another aspect on which I have spoken at a few forums, that we have a lot of MSMEs who opt for filing quarterly returns. Now a large company which deals with large number of MSME may find it very difficult that we need to wait for 3 months to see whether those invoices are appearing in 2A or not. And by the time 3 months, given the working capital situation that always prevail almost, no company having ever has that kind of surplus. So they say, okay, why we should wait for 3 months and why we should then deal with MSME? Why not we deal with only those vendors who file return on a monthly basis? And so that we are able to see who has uploaded the invoice on 12th or 13th of the month. And therefore, it is only an issue which is going to hurt MSME more than the large taxpayers. I have spoken about this in few forums, that this is hurting MSME. This is going to hurt MSME more than the large companies. But given the government's own limitations in terms of revenue, I guess this is going to be the case. So what is the solution? Can we allow MSME to die down in this company, which is backbone of my industrial activity, which contribute a huge amount of employment generation and export revenue? The answer is clearly no. So what we can do? We advise all our those MSMEs that it is in their business interest to move away from quarterly return to monthly return. They should move from quarterly return to monthly return. It should add a little bit of compliance, but they would be seen as a better compliant vendor, and large companies would be more than happy to deal with them as compared to a typical MSME, which is filing quarterly return and losing business. So this is going to be the way forward. Of course, once we have a new return format of ANX 1 and ANX 2 and those kind of things already implemented, then this problem will automatically go away, because that would have this kind of matching and all. But till the time that is implemented, and we do not know, we have seen GST dates getting kind of extended, almost every date get extended. So you move to monthly return, and once the new return format is implemented, then this problem is going to go away. So my request is to all the professionals and all the people who are working in this field, advise your management or to your client that you should file monthly return instead of quarterly return, because that is going to hurt you more than the client, and that is going to be a business loss. Okay, so that is my little solution here on rule 36.4. I hope 36.4 is clear to you all. Wonderful. Okay. Now, the next topic is treatment of advances received. Okay. Now, advance is a very, very typical situation. You know, we started from excise, we were in sale tax regime, there were never a tax on the advance. It was always, in fact, in excise, payment of tax was even deferred. How deferred? The tax was on activity of manufacture, but payment of tax was deferred to removal. So I manufacture something, removal will happen either same day or subsequently, and when it is removed, I pay tax. In VAT also, I pay tax only when sale is being made. Then comes the service tax. Service tax even was more beautiful. They say, okay, don't worry. Once you receive your money, you pay tax. Okay, so initially, you know, service tax was on receipt of payment. So if you receive money, you pay tax. If you don't receive money, don't pay tax. Till the time you receive money, I'm not asking you tax. So we were very happy. Okay, we receive money, we pay tax. Then government say, no. This is not what we, I want money first. So they say, okay, you raise invoice, you provide service, or you provide, or you receive money, you have to pay tax. So service tax has become advance or service is rendered, whichever is, or advance or invoice raised, then you have to pay tax on this. Then the question came in that how can you ask me to pay tax when taxable event has not happened? The taxable event was provision of service or rendering of service. And then Act was amended, and it says that service is rendered or to be rendered. Similarly, if you look into the GST, the definition of supply, it says supplied goods or services supplied or agreed to be supplied. So this is the importance of this agreed to be supplied, that enables government to ask you to pay tax on advance received, even if the supply has not yet been made. Okay. So that is the amendment of the taxable event. With the little bit tweaking, government says, okay, you receive advance, you pay tax. When you make supply, you pay tax. Even after making supply, you do not get your money. Okay, that is bad luck. We have so many courts with a lot of crowd. You file a civil suit. It will take maybe 20, 30, 40 years, few generation. Once you get money, good luck to you. But it is, you pay tax on the first place. So taxable event, you know, that is there. And initially, advance, it was on both goods and services. So you receive advance for goods, you pay tax. You receive advance for services, you pay tax. So it was on both activities. What happened thereafter? Then they said, okay, on goods, we can give some relaxation, because people said in goods, we have to procure a lot of raw material, we have procured a lot of things, and we may not have to pay that much of tax. We may have a lot of input tax credit, but input tax credit is going to come to me only once I receive the goods and services. So if I pay tax on advance and I receive a lot of input tax credit subsequently, it may happen that I may not have a sufficient amount of output tax liability to utilize that input tax credit. And my working capital get blocked for a long period of time. So government realized that this thing, and they say, okay, we'll give benefit to some small taxpayers. So what they did, they issued a notification. They say, okay, the assessees having turnover of less than 1.5 crore in the previous year, okay, they are not liable to pay tax, but people, other large taxpayer and the taxpayer under composition scheme, they have to pay tax on advance received. That was the first relaxation that came in, but then large taxpayers say that we are also facing the same issue, and the input tax credit blockage and the working capital blockage issue is hurting us as well. It is hurting the large taxpayers also. And then government removed that restriction of 1.5 crore, and they say, okay, all people who receive advance for goods are not liable to pay tax on advance. It is only on the supply. Services, everybody has to pay tax on the receipt of advance, okay, like it was in service tax. So that is the position now. Okay, on services you pay tax as when you receive advance, and you pay tax in case of goods only when supply is being made. This issue was, there was one issue in services regime. In case of works contract, you supply both goods and services. In service tax regime, service tax was charging tax only to services, and in VAT it was charged, VAT was only charging on goods. Now what happened? In service tax, tax was payable on advance. In VAT, no tax was payable on advance. So what people used to argue that, sir, whatever advance I have received, whatever mobilization advance I have received, that is for the goods and nothing for the service. And sometimes they used to manage to take a letter from the customer contractee also telling them that, sir, you are paying me 10 crore of advance, and if I have to pay service tax and VAT on this amount, then I will not left with money to buy material, and I will not be able to start the project. So if you want to give me 10 crore advance, give me a letter that this advance is for the goods. If you do not want to give me a letter, then give me 12 crore rupees, because I will use that additional money for payment of tax, and 10 crore I will use for buying material and for all other activities for your project. So the customer also sometimes says, okay, fine, this is saving me some money. And he used to give you a letter that, yes, this advance is towards goods. And there was no tax on advance receipts for the goods. But in GST regime, can you do this? Works contract, very rightly said, works contract is a supply of service. In case of works contract now, works contract is a supply of service. And if works contract is a supply of service and you have to pay tax on the advance received for providing services, you do not have that kind of leeway now. You have to ask 12 crore to that person that, no, there is no choice. I have to pay tax now, and I will not be able to start your project with 10 crore. Kindly give me 12 crore, and only then I will be able to pay tax and start your project also. So please, whosoever kind of handled that transaction in the VAT regime, change your understanding. Works contract is no more a supply of goods and services. It is deemed to be a supply of service under the GST law. So if there is any advance received for providing works contract service, tax is to be payable even on the first mobilization advance received. Okay. Now then comes the question. Once I receive an advance and I have to pay tax also, so what document I issue? Do I issue an invoice, or what document is required to be issued? The law provides that you issue a receipt voucher. The moment you receive a receipt voucher, okay, because invoice is to be issued when you supply goods or services. So you issue a receipt voucher and you charge tax, and you indicate tax on that, and you pay tax by declaring the receipt voucher in your returns. Okay. Once you supply invoice, supply goods or services, or supplies services, you raise invoice, and whatever tax is being paid in receipt voucher, you adjust that and you pay tax on the basis of what is the amount remaining after adjusting invoice advance. Now that's how far if I am able to provide service. But in these kind of regime, COVID-19 era, it may be possible that a lot of my service contract got cancelled. People say, sir, we have actually given you advance for a marriage, and now this is all marriage is cancelled. We do not know what is happening. So please, whatever amount I paid for your banquet hall, you have to give me that amount back. And I say, okay, boss, I'm incurring a lot of my expenses. I'm salary, rent, interest, and all that. So I do not have money. They say, oh, no, sir, that is your problem. And I say, okay, I'm a good man. I need to do business with you in future. I decide to give you the money that I've taken as an advance. At that time, I can issue a refund voucher. So I issue a refund voucher and I indicate whatever amount I'm refunding, and I indicate whatever tax I've received originally, which again is being refunded. And on basis of refund voucher, I can refund amount of advance received and amount of tax. And I declare my refund voucher also in my returns and adjust it against my tax liability. So that's how you deal with advance by issuing a receipt voucher and by issuing a refund voucher. So this is what I have to say on advance. I hope that is also clear to all. Okay, next topic is credit notes and debit notes. Now, that is also a very fine distinction. I would like to tell this my very intelligent audience that debit note, credit note is not a transaction or cannot be a transaction by itself. Very often people say, sir, can I take input tax credit on debit note, or I have to give tax show tax, or I can reduce my credit note. Now you can reduce your credit note, you have to pay tax on debit note. That comes from charging sections or the valuation sections or the input tax credit sections. Debit note and credit note is a mechanism, is a documentation to communicate with your business partner, with your vendor, with your supplier, with your customer, and also with the tax authority that yes, this nature of transaction I have done. This nature of transaction is documented by way of credit note and debit note. And if the law allow you to take action on the basis of nature of transaction, then you declare debit note and credit note in your return and take the benefit or pay tax thereon. It is not that credit note in its all generosity for whatever reason would become eligible for a deduction from output tax liability. Or it will not be a situation where a debit note in all its forms and for all different categories of transaction become chargeable to tax. No, debit notes and credit notes are only documents which will reflect the underlying transaction, and the law applicable to underlying transaction that would prevail over debit note and credit note. This is extremely important, that you do not take a decision on the basis of envelope. You read the letter within. I hope I'm making this clear. It is the nature of transaction that is the key. It is not what is the mode or what is the document which is being raised. Of course, there are restrictions to which you can issue credit note, debit note. There are restrictions for which you can issue these. Okay. So we would see what are those situations which have been provided in the law. But again, coming back, situation cannot be that you take a decision on the basis of this document. Okay. Now, having said that, we come to the section 34 of the CGST Act, which provides for a situation where you can issue a credit note, debit note. So they say where one or more tax invoice has been issued for supply of goods or services. So the first condition is you should have issued an invoice for supply of any goods or services. So you should have raised an invoice. Only then the question of debit note and credit note comes into picture. And we have already seen, if we have received an advance for which there is no supply which has already been made, when there was no supply having been made, there was no invoice. And in absence of invoice, we could not have issued credit note. We could have issued only a refund voucher. Okay. So where an invoice has already been issued for supply of any goods and services, in that situation, you can issue a credit note. Now, credit note, what says? It says where taxable value or tax charged. Taxable value on the invoice or tax charged on the invoice exceeds the taxable value and tax charge for that particular supply. Now, law does not define you here that what are the circumstances in which taxable value will be deemed to be more as compared to taxable value of that supply. And there could be multiple reasons. If you go to section 15 valuation, where they talk about discount, if the discount is not issued on the face of invoice at the time of supply, but issued subsequently, and it complies with the conditions that are prescribed there, then you are eligible for deduction of discount from your taxable turnover. You are also eligible to reduce your tax liability in relation to that discount. But what is the document? The document is the credit note. In case of discount, you can say, yes, my taxable value at tax charge exceeds the taxable value and tax charge for that supply, and therefore I am eligible to issue a credit note and also eligible to take credit or reduce my output tax liability and from whatever was declared earlier. Second situation, where you have supplied goods, they are returned by the recipient. So you supply goods to him, the goods are found to be defective, there could be any other situation, the goods are returned by the supplier. In that situation, you issue a credit note. Where goods and services are found to be deficient, you supplied certain goods, you supplied certain services, the customer say, no, these goods are not up to the quality, these are not up to the mark. So somebody in Delhi has supplied goods to, let's say, who is customer in Odisha, and customer in Odisha say that no, these goods are not up to my mark, they are not the quality that I have agreed for, and I will not accept these goods. So you say, okay, sir, you are my good customer, I appreciate there may be some challenges with the quality, but if I and you start thinking that if I take the goods back to Delhi, this much is going to be the freight, this much is going to be the other expenses related therein. So what do? You say, sir, I'm giving you a 10% discount and kindly accept these goods, and I will give you a credit note for the 10% discount so that your loss on the shorter quality of goods, because I understand it is of defective quality, you may be able to sell on a lower amount. So I'm giving you a discount, I'm giving you a reducing the price, and I'm giving you a credit note, and you can adjust that from my payment. So that is the third situation in which you can issue a credit note, which is provided under section 34. So what is the situation? taxable value or tax exceeds the taxable value or tax in relation to that supply. Goods are returned by the customer, and goods and services supplied are found to be deficient. In that case, you can issue one or more credit notes to your customers. Now, sometime we have seen in case of our clients, when goods are returned to the supplier, what happens? The recipient issues an invoice as well. So what happens that here you are issuing a credit note and the customer has issued an invoice. Now you can see two documents which are being issued for same transactions. This is an issue which you have to be very, very carefully address. That yes, there may be a communication between the two parties, that if he is returning the goods, he should not issue an invoice, or if he is issuing an invoice, he should not issue a credit note. Now, what is the challenge that comes in customer issuing an invoice? What issue comes in? That most of the cases, a particular party is either registered in their software as a vendor or as a customer. And the way ERPs are structured, it becomes difficult for receiving or entering an invoice from a person who is your customer. Okay. So in that situation, since you cannot accept an invoice from your customer, it is only logical conclusion or logical way out for you is to tell your customer that you do not issue an invoice. You may return the goods on a delivery challan, and I would issue you a credit note so that our accounts are settled. Now, you can have number of examples of taxable value and tax exceeding the amount or goods returned. Okay. So there can be numerous commercial transactions, not possible, and I do not want to go into listing of those transactions because that would become kind of a long story by itself. But what we need to see how this is being, the transactions are structured. Only one party issued the document. Earlier, there was a challenge in the software that you could link only one invoice against a particular credit note. Now what happened? That doesn't happen that way. Business may issue one credit note for a particular party for supplies made to him over a period of time. Generally, large companies have these quantity discounts. Quantity discounts are reconciled at the end of 3 months or at the end of season. If you take an example of company like Coca-Cola. Now, Coca-Cola accounts team or the sales team would not like to spend even a minute in the month of June for reconciling the quantity. They say, let's supply the material to you. You sell the material to the parties. Okay. And once our season is over, thereafter we will sit, we will reconcile our accounts, we will see the supplies, and we would issue a credit note for all the invoices that has been issued to you right from March till July. Fair enough, both parties agree, say okay, fine. But GSTN software was only allowing you initially to link one output invoice against one credit note. And there can be a situation also that you receive one credit note for one invoice and the customer is not satisfied. He makes another claim to the company, sir, you have set 10% additional discount, and then your sales manager has told me 5% more, so it should be 15%, but I have received credit note only of 10%, so I need another credit note for 5%. Company agrees, issue another credit note, so we have two credit note for one invoice, and my GSTN software was not permitting me. What do I do? because that was not also clear in the law. Subsequently, it was clarified, law was amended, that you could issue one or more credit notes for one invoice and one credit note for more invoices. So you can have multiple invoices for one credit note or multiple credit notes for one invoice. Whatever is your suits you, you can do that. But they say stay within the limit of a financial year. You cannot have one credit note which covers the transaction of March and of April. We understand you have a season, so but you cover the transaction. Transaction should be of one financial year covered in one set of credit notes and another financial year covered under another set of credit note. You cannot merge transactions in multiple financial years. So that is the limit that you need to careful about. Another thing you need to careful about, that when you issue credit note, you declare credit note in the return for the month in which credit note was issued. You cannot go back and amend your return for all the month for which supplies were made. No. For the supplies made, let's say in April, May, June, you issue credit note in July. You show that in the month of return in the for the month of July, which you will file in the month of August. Okay. There may be companies which say, no, we will not do, we'll do only at the end of the year, because that's how we are able to reconcile. Fair enough. You do a reconciliation. You do reconciliation for a complete financial year. You issue one credit note for all the transactions of one financial year. Okay. And declare in the return, but before filing the return for the September next year. September next year is the time when you have to issue credit note. Beyond that, you would not be able to issue a credit note for the supplies made in a particular financial year. And I believe that is a very reasonable time if you are not able to reconcile your accounts, because by September your audit is also done, your returns are also filed, and therefore you should be able to determine what is the amount of credit note to be issued, and therefore that is the outer time limit that one has to keep in mind. So two important small points that have to be kept in mind. One, credit note cannot be spread over multiple financial year, and credit note has to be issued before filing return of September or annual return for that year, whichever is earlier. So that is for credit note. Credit requirement of what credit note should constitute, that is also given. So all the usual thing, name, address of supplier, recipient, number of documents, all these things are there listed. I don't have to go into, that is a list which is already there. So those transactions have to be mentioned. In that case, credit note can be issued. Excuse me. Now, next question comes in, and that's a very generally people ask that what happened, can I issue a financial credit note? Can I issue a credit note without having GST on it? Or can or because if you want to reduce your tax liability, you go to section 15, where they say correspondingly input tax credit should have been reversed by the recipient. Now, you know, I do not have a control over the recipient's accounts. I do not know whether he has reversed the credit. I have no mechanism or no control to ensure that he has reversed the credit. Tomorrow there'll be a GST audit. So department authority will ask me, show how your recipient has reversed the credit. And if I'm not able to reverse it, I will be faced with the liability. I will face with interest. There'll be penalty. So he said, I do not want to get into this. I will tell him that whatever tax was charged by me on the invoice, you have taken credit. Fine. Let's end of the story. I'm giving you credit note. only as a financial transaction. So neither I reduce my output tax liability, nor you reduce your input tax credit. So many people ask whether that situation is permissible. My dear friends, that situation is permissible. So you can issue financial credit note, and you can issue a credit note which does not have a GST amount thereon. So that you need not even declare in your returns, because it does not reduce your taxable turnover for the purpose of GST. It does not reduce your tax liability, and it does not reduce input tax credit which has been availed by the recipient. So you can issue financial credit note, and in my experience, in majority of the situation, issuance of financial credit note is a better tool rather than issuing a credit note with GST thereon and then collecting evidences that the recipient has actually reversed the input tax credit. Okay. So that is on credit note. I hope I'm clear on credit note. There is another aspect which is there in the law, and which all the people who have been dealing with indirect tax, they are very well aware, is a concept of unjust enrichment. Now, if let's say I have raised an invoice on a customer, and customer has supplied that goods to his customer and utilized the credit that was there on my invoice. Now the input tax credit has already been utilized by my recipient, and it has been passed on to the next person. Now in that situation, it becomes very difficult to ensure that the entire chain has actually reversed the input tax credit. In that situation, credit note with GST liability should not be issued, and law specifically prohibits it. It says that no reduction in output tax liability can be done if the incidence of tax has been passed on to the next person. So if you believe that your customer has already supplied goods or services and charged tax thereon utilizing and used your credit, then in such cases, financial credit note should be issued and GST benefit should not be claimed. Now we go to, let's say, debit note. Debit note is very simple. It does not give you that much liberty. Because what is debit note? Debit note says where taxable in amount and tax is found to be short. So if taxable value and tax is found to be short, obviously government says, boss, you raise a debit note, you charge tax on it, and you kindly pay me tax. Okay. So where the taxable value or tax is found to be short, it is not an option with the supplier. It is a mandatory condition, because section 34 for debit note uses the word shall, and for credit note use the word may. So debit note is mandatory for you to be issued. Credit note is optional. So debit note you issue where taxable value or tax is found to be short. Now that can be for variety of reasons. Again, number of commercial transactions can happen. There may be a situation where by mistake I might have charged less amount. There may be a situation by mistake I might have charged lower rate of tax. There may be a situation I am raising a debit note for interest on delayed payment. There can be a situation where I'm raising debit note for any other penalty or any other stuff. So wherever there is a debit note for a particular transaction, which is covered by definition of supply and covered by valuation rule, it is obligatory on the taxpayer to charge tax on that debit note and declare in the return for the month in which it was issued. There is no limit for debit note to be declared in the September return, because government says when you forget, there is no time limit. So if you forget, you issue whenever you want to issue, you please issue. So if you forget to charge less amount, you charge less amount, you realize that after 2 years later, kindly pay tax me 2 years later. I will give you benefit only for the 6 months, but you kindly give me benefit. You pay me tax even after 2 years. So that is how government functions. Then it is another question. The law also says the debit note includes supplementary invoice. So we have a situation where there are supplementary invoices are being raised, which is also very prevalent in several companies. Let's say in automobile sector, let's assume Maruti launch a model and it tells its vendor that you generate plant and machinery and I will buy 1 lakh pieces of a particular part from you during a year. That model doesn't work out. People do not like it. And Maruti is able to sell or only make 30,000 units of that particular model. All the vendors say, sir, we have invested, assuming that you will buy 1 lakh pieces, and all our depreciation, all our pricing, all our amortization was based on 1 lakh pieces per annum for next 5 years. You discontinued the model after 30,000 pieces. We are not able to recover our interest. We are not able to recover our depreciation. We are not able to recover our investment. So you need to give us price rise. Maruti says, yes, I understand, I appreciate. And earlier price were 400 rupees. You raise me a supplementary invoice of 200 rupees for this loss that has happened. So debit note includes that supplementary invoice as well. So whenever there would be a supplementary invoice that would be raised, on that tax would also be charged. So debit note includes a supplementary invoice. Accordingly, that's a debit note or supplementary invoice that would be declared in your GST returns for the month in which it was issued. Okay. Again, remember, there is no time limit for issuing a debit note. Okay. I hope debit note is also clear to you guys. Yes. Anybody still? Yes. Many people. What I request that you can send your queries, and what we will do, we will Hostbook probably can formulate a mechanism where they can collate all the queries and send it to us, and then we can respond all the queries, and it will go to all the attendees. Thank you very much. Thank you all the lovely audience for staying with me till the end of the session. Thank you.